Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Alice Buffkin. I am the Director of Data and Policy at Citizens Committee for Children of New York. Welcome to Safeguarding Wellbeing, Supports for Families Experiencing Housing Instability, hosted by Citizens Committee for Children and the Family Homelessness Coalition. This is the second of a three-part series focused on building New York City's future, a children's agenda for the next mayor and city leaders. For those of you unfamiliar with the Family Homelessness Coalition, or FHC, this is a coalition made up of organizations representing service and housing providers and children's advocacy organizations, united by the goal of preventing family homelessness, improving the well-being of children and families in shelter, and supporting the long-term stability of families with children who leave shelter. Today, we will be hearing from some incredible advocates and experts who will shine a light on the experiences of families facing housing instability and uplift critical policy solutions to help address the homelessness crisis. And it is nearly impossible to overstate the urgency of this issue. In fiscal year 2025, there were on average more than 54,000 children living in family shelters in New York City. In fact, the majority of New Yorkers in shelter, nearly 70%, are families with children. And the average length of stay for families in shelter was 405 days this past September. That is over a year of destabilization and uncertainty, of isolation from support networks, of academic challenges as families struggle to keep their children consistently enrolled in school. There's an extensive body of research on the negative social and emotional toll that shelter involvement can have on families and children as they develop, which points to the desperate need to reduce and eliminate families' experiences with shelter and housing instability more broadly. Those 54,000 children in family shelters are in addition to the more than 82,000 students who were doubled up last year, meaning they were temporarily living with others because they lost housing or were experiencing financial hardship. Jennifer Pringle from Advocates for Children, who authored the report the data is based on, will dive into those findings more in detail later in the webinar. We all know that these staggering numbers are not a result of chance. They are a result of a system of inequities that have driven families, particularly Black and Latinx children and families, into untenable positions. Affordable housing is a central part of the problem, as we all know. Half of New York City renters are rent burdened, meaning they pay 30% of their income on rent, while nearly 1 in 3 New York City renters are severely rent burdened, meaning half of their income goes towards rent. A recent state comptroller report found that family homelessness in New York City doubled between 2022 and 2024, and the youth homelessness rate rose by 170% in that same period. Much of this increase can be attributed to the end of New York City's eviction moratorium and the number of new migrants seeking shelter in the past several years. And our city still has enormous work ahead to support immigrant New Yorkers in the face of escalating federal attacks on this community. Other factors like domestic violence and overcrowded housing had driven too many families into unstable housing conditions and shelter. New York City, like the rest of the country, is also facing new threats from a federal administration that has already begun to chip away at critical housing resources. However, we're also looking ahead to a new mayor-elect who has made housing affordability a central tenet of his platform. This is an opportunity to draw attention to the scope and impact of family homelessness in New York City and to uplift transformative changes that can put New York on a path towards eliminating family homelessness. Today, our panelists will offer bold solutions for how New York City can do right by our families and children, and how city leaders can strengthen supports for families in shelter, prevent homelessness through upstream interventions, and ensure every child has a safe and stable place to call home. Our panel moderator today will be Jean Marie Evely, Executive Editor for City Limits, who has done some amazing coverage of housing issues in New York City. Our panel is made up of steering committee members from the Family Homelessness Coalition. Those panelists include Gina Cappuccini, who's the Senior Director of Housing Access and Stability Services at New Destiny Housing, Khadijah Davis, Narrative Change Lead of the Family Action Board, Vanjie Gonzalez, Policy Lead of the Family Action Board, Maya Jasinska, Director of Policy and Research at WIN NYC, and Jocelyn Truitt, Vice President of Empowerment at Riseborough. Thank you all again for joining us, and Jean Marie, I'm going to turn it over to you to kick us off.
Thank you, Alice. I appreciate it. And thank you to CCC and the Family Homelessness Coalition for having me today and having City Limits be a part of this important conversation. I would love to open it up and get things started with our panelists by asking each of them to tell us briefly about the organization or organizations that they work with and what those organizations do in the fight against homelessness here. Gina, you want to kick us off?
Thank you so much. So welcome everyone. Gina Cappuccini. I work with New Destiny Housing, and with New Destiny we are 100% dedicated to permanent housing solutions for domestic violence survivors. We both operate permanent supportive housing for domestic violence survivors exiting shelter, and also provide rapid rehousing and other community-based solutions to help survivors access permanent housing within the community. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Gina. And Khadijah.
Hello.
Oh, I think you're on mute, Khadijah.
Sorry
There you
about that. Hello. My name is Khadijah, and I work with the Family Action Board, which is one of the co-conveners of the Family Homelessness Coalition. And what I particularly do, I work with narrative change, making sure that people who are formerly homeless in shelters have a voice, and that people understand that a lot of times they are hidden homeless, and they come there from many different directions, but they all have a story, and that's not their only story in life, and that they can make changes and make sure the policies change also in New York City.
Great, thank you. Vanjie?
Hi, everyone. My name is Vanjie, and I'm also with the Family Action Board. The Family Action Board is a peer-driven advocacy and action body committed to improving the outcomes for families experiencing housing instability and facing homelessness. We are currently working on 3 focus areas, which are policy and advocacy, peer navigation, and narrative change.
Great, thank you. Maya?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I work for WIN, formerly known as Women in Need. We are the largest provider of shelter and supportive housing to families with children in New York City. We operate 16 shelters throughout the 5 boroughs, as well as almost 500 units of supportive housing. And each night we house about 6,500 people, including about 3,600 children.
Great, and last but not least, Jocelyn?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jocelyn. I work for Riseboro Community Partnership, which is a large social service and affordable housing nonprofit, and we are primarily rooted in North Brooklyn, in the neighborhood of Bushwick. I oversee our empowerment division, which primarily includes our eviction and homelessness prevention programming. For those of you, who live or work or know New York City services, that includes our home-based programs, as well as our right to counsel eviction defense practice.
Great, and topically, we'll start with a discussion about prevention, and I'd love to start with you, Jocelyn. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the most common reasons that you encounter that a family might find themselves at risk of homelessness, and things that the next administration can do to address some of those problems further upstream?
Sure. So a huge portion of my work is spent overseeing prevention initiatives. And I can tell you both anecdotally and statistically that the majority of people who access our prevention programs who are at risk of homelessness, outside of domestic violence, which I know Gina will probably touch on a lot more when we get to her, but come to us seeking assistance because, very basically, people cannot afford the cost of living in New York City. I know that there are a lot of households whose working wage just is not comparable to the cost of living in New York City. And for a lot of families, particularly low income families, taking a financial hit or having to endure a sort of out of pocket, unexpected financial cost can really throw a family into into a situation where falling behind on a month of rent can snowball into all of a sudden being behind 6 or 12 months of rent. And, in New York City, we are a very renter-friendly city in that tenants and renters do have a lot of protections and a lot of rights, despite the fact that we also do have a lot of abusive landlords in New York City. So, families can, put aside paying the rent 1 month without the fear of being evicted the next month. And so, for folks that are managing very tight incomes and very limited incomes, diverting the cost of or the money put aside to rent to pay for something else that might be more urgent, like medical costs or funeral costs or childcare, food, transportation, may be more urgent than paying the rent that month. But without having the sort of financial safety net or social safety net to catch that family, it can be very easy to fall behind. And so that typically is what we see. Since also the expansion of city FEPs over the last couple of years, a huge amount of the work that we do through our programs is subsidy management. So a lot of folks fall into more significant arrears than they're actually in because of some administrative or bureaucratic blip with their subsidy program that has thrown it out of compliance, and therefore, that family is on the hook for the full amount of arrears, which includes the subsidized amount covered by the city or the state portion. So a lot of what we do is, administrative case management to help that family get back on track with their subsidy, make sure that it's in compliance and that, payments are being accurately and on time and timely sent to the landlord, and that the client is aware of the portion that they owe, but also, when their recertification and all of the sort of other compliance deadlines, that they're aware of those things and can maintain their subsidy in good standing. I will say that, one of the Mayor-elect Mamdani's platforms around increasing the minimum wage, I think really has to be something that is prioritized. Rents in New York City are not going down. We hope that they don't go much farther up, but we do need to sort of close the gap on what the sort of average working wage is in New York City with what the cost of living is, because without something to subsidize some cost, it is nearly impossible for the majority of families in New York to afford living here. And soon this will be a city that we no longer recognize, in addition to the threat of losing more and more affordable housing, because without folks that are able to pay their rent, affordable housing developers and providers are not, including Riseborough, are not going to be able to withstand the hit that they're taking on losing such massive amounts of money in lost rent. So I'll stop there.
No, thank you. Lots to think about there. So obviously, issues with subsidies and streamlining and fixing problems in that process sounds like a very important part of it. You mentioned the minimum wage, which we know was a sort of point of debate between the mayoral candidates during the election. Would love to ask Gina, along the similar lines, since you all work so closely with families experiencing domestic violence, we know the role that that plays as a lead cause of homelessness. What are things that you think the city could be doing better, or our incoming mayor could do better to address and prevent homelessness with that particular population before families experience that hardship?
Thank you. Yeah, as we have cited in our own domestic violence report, A Crisis Compounded, domestic violence is a leading cause of entry into homeless shelters. So providing quicker responses while survivors are still in community and allowing them to be able to make steps to access new permanent housing without having to go into shelter is incredibly critical. Under the EHV Housing Navigation Program, we saw 1,200 vouchers issued to survivors in community that allowed them to access a subsidy to locate new permanent housing without entering shelter. The program was incredibly successful, but now so many of those participants are at risk of losing their subsidies because the federal government did not adequately fund the program for the 10-year term that it was guaranteed. What we're concerned about now is not just survivors who are now looking for housing and subsidies, but those who already received it having to make the difficult choice in the future, in the coming year, to either enter shelter or return to an abusive partner once that subsidy is lost. But more broadly and future forward, broadening the eligibility for DV survivors to access local subsidies in the community, so thinking about city FEPs and FEPs, making that eligibility process easier for home-based providers to manage. The demand is so high for services that can result in longer wait times. And so having the city take on additional steps to improve that process and make community-based organizations work easier to serve survivors of domestic violence is incredibly important right now. In addition, with survivors of domestic violence who are living in public housing, many have to wait years before an emergency transfer is facilitated. So as we see so many thousands of units remain vacant within public housing, taking on additional steps to ensure that those units can be brought up to inspection code as quickly as possible so that people can move into those apartments more quickly. And as Jocelyn was mentioning, there are so many different financial strains that families are facing. So really looking to increase access to flexible funding for survivors of domestic violence and other low-income households is really critical so that there isn't that need to choose between rent and other emergency expenses that are coming their way.
Yeah. Thank you, Gina. I appreciate that. I would love to next ask Khadijah and Vanjie. You mentioned the Family Action Board, and I would love to just hear a little bit more. This is sort of a board, the idea being that families with lived experience of homelessness are driving the conversations around solutions. Can you tell us more about the board, who makes it up, and some of the work that you're all doing?
So I could start off. Hi, I'm one of the leaders. As like I said before, the person in narrative change. Vanjie does policy. We have another leader named Rhonda, and we have three people who are two people are under us. Also we have Lorden, and we have Akira, and we have Kizzy, and we all work together as a team. We all have different areas that we work in, but we also work together to make sure that we can change policy in general. A lot of times people who never lived as homeless before speak for the people, and it's good to have allies, but I feel like it really gets to the heart of the people when the people who have actually experienced it can tell you what we wanted and would have liked if when we were in that position, and also we talk about it in narrative change, but we have to also change it in policy. There's a lot of times we say we don't like this, but we feel like we don't have a way to speak about it or do anything about it. And this is our way of giving back to our community by changing policy, by making sure that our people have a voice on the podcast, and to making sure we have another part for peer navigation that can make sure we can speak to the people who were like us and say it's going to be okay and things are going to happen better for you in the future. This is not your last stop. This is just a part of your story, and you are bigger than this, and it will make you become even a better person and make you stronger.
Yeah, that's so important. You mentioned policy too. Vanjie, could you talk a little bit about the policy side of what the Family Action Board is doing?
Okay, so for the policy side, we're trying to strengthen our advocacy efforts and elevate the voices of people with lived experience. We want to bring those voices to the table and get kind of like insider knowledge on the systems that need to be changed. As Khadijah said, a lot of the changes are done from the top down, and we'd like to help people, families that are experiencing homelessness, to participate in these conversations and kind of make decisions regarding, the shelter system, and changes that they would like to see that they feel would be beneficial. Our peer navigation team wants to help families with the New York City housing system. And then our narrative team, seeks to break the stigma surrounding homelessness and change the narrative.
Great, that's so important. Thank you both for sharing. I would love to ask you, Maya, moving on to, we talked a little bit about prevention. When somebody does lose their housing and they want to enter the shelter system, they have to go through what's called the intake process for families with children in New York City. That's going up to the Bronx to the PATH Intake Center. At City Limits, we've reported for years on sort of like what a stressful process that is. And I would love to talk about what, if you could tell us some of those kind of challenges to intake that you see with the families you work with.
Absolutely. Despite a legal right to shelter in New York City, shelter itself is actually incredibly difficult to access, and families have to undergo an incredibly grueling and often re-traumatizing process to even apply for shelter. So as you mentioned, PATH is the centralized intake center for families with children applying for shelter. There is one location for all 5 boroughs. So if you are experiencing homelessness on Staten Island, guess what? You're going to the Bronx, and you must bring all of your belongings with you. When you arrive at PATH, the application process requires you to demonstrate your last 2 years of housing history. So this is for DHS's language to help determine if you have any alternative housing options. So is there a way basically for DHS to divert you from the shelter system? Needless to say, demonstrating 2 years of housing history when you might be fleeing from domestic violence, when you may have experienced lockouts or have experienced street homelessness, is an incredibly arduous burden. And furthermore, to verify that 2 years of housing history, past staff will then call whoever you were staying with before and verify every single location. But that might require calling your former abuser, or if you were kicked out because you were living in a doubled up and then discordant situation, that person might not feel like answering the phone from an unknown number or opening the door for someone they don't know to attest to the fact that you had lived there previously. And ultimately, these denials that are in the name of diversion out of the shelter system end up actually being a system of deterrence. And because City FEP's eligibility is predicated on being found eligible for shelter, it is actually about, it actually ends up being a process that is a barrier to long-term housing stability. And so we believe that there are some tweaks that the city can make to improve this process. And Khadijah's smiling because she has given a lot of input into these pieces of legislation. But one thing that WIN is advocating for, and it's a piece of legislation in the city council right now, is to reduce that housing history from 2 years to 1 year. And another key piece is that we believe that after you have experienced your first eligibility denial, a family should be able to self-attest to their housing history. We found that about 80% of applications are denied on this housing history requirement. And for some kind of additional context, it takes WIN clients on average 2 to 3 times to apply before being found eligible for shelter. In fiscal year 25, we had one client apply as many as 20 times. It took one client over 314 days to be found eligible for shelter. So this sort of notion of being diverted, the problem is that clients actually end up in this sort of doom loop of conditional placements where they receive a conditional placement upon applying. They have 10 days before they need to reapply while their housing history is being investigated. But so often clients are denied and then don't actually have somewhere else to go, or are told instead that, this person can host you because they have room on their floor. And as a result, clients end up reapplying, and never actually making progress towards long-term housing stability.
Wow. 20 times that's nuts. Khadijah, you were nodding. Did you have anything to add in terms of like other ways that you think the shelter intake process should be fixed? Obviously, making that history look back period that Maya mentioned seems like an important one.
I was that person who went back and forth and got denied. At a time, they actually didn't even put me to a placement. It's been a while. And I think being more trauma informed and being more understanding to people on where they are, because people who need help, they don't need you to pass judgment on them. They don't need you to be this person. Be trauma informed and make sure that you're taking your job seriously and really don't be another worst part onto already a problem that they already have in their life. So just be a better person and to make the systems just more easier for people to really go in and get what they need and make sure they get back on their feet with their families.
Great, yeah. Any other, I was going to ask Jocelyn if you had anything to add. I know Riseboro works closely with this too. Any other intake things? It sounds to me like having another location would be a big improvement. Because you mentioned obviously somebody having to go all the way from another borough to the Bronx, right? But yeah, anything else that anyone else wanted to add to the intake reforms?
Yeah, I think, everything that everybody just mentioned, we on the prevention side get a lot of referrals from PATH for folks who have been diverted, basically found ineligible for shelter because they have somebody who's willing to sort of put them up for, an undisclosed amount of time. And so they're sent back into the community. Certainly these households can get additional support from programs like ours, like Home Base, but again, we, for example, in our Brownsville program, we see a huge number of people diverted back to the community from shelter intake. This is one of the zip codes that has the highest shelter entry rates across the city. And we just don't have enough resources to be able to adequately serve these households. So, again, I think that there's a lot to be said about, additional ways that the city can invest in prevention programs. Because I think if we spent a lot more time and resources bolstering prevention efforts, we wouldn't have to spend as much time and resources, and then also exposing families to the trauma that is having to be displaced from their home and go into a homeless shelter further downstream. So.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. Back to Khadijah, you mentioned briefly the Hear Our Voices podcast. I know you've got the logo in the back of your video there. Could you tell us a little bit about the podcast, sort of how was it conceived, and what are some of your goals for it?
So this was conceived, I want to say 3 or 4 years ago. And we at the time were fellows. As only, I want to say 2 of us at the time, Rhonda and I. She's one of our other leaders in our group. And we wanted to find a way of doing something for families. A lot of times people talk about homelessness, but families with children are kind of left out. And people think that we have so much. I'm like, we're struggling in this corner. And we're like, we need a voice. We need a face. We need to do something that is ours. And nobody could take that away from us. And that's how Hear Our Voices has started. And I do a bunch of things, and it's going through, and it's fun. And I love doing podcasting. I also do YouTube. And one part of it is to make sure that people have a voice. That's very important, that it's nice that people tell stories, do op-eds and it's not kind of thing, but to hear it from the person's mouth of how the experience is important. And I love to hear the success stories. I love to hear when people say, I moved out and this is where I am now, or I have a new business, and really how this is only just literally a bump in the road. I think people think that's like, this person's homeless and they're homeless forever. But to really hear the stories of the people and how their kids have grown through this experience, that's really what the podcast is about. That's one of what the podcast is about. Another part of it is also, like I said before, changing policies. Policies are important because we might be upset that something's happening, but there's a rule behind why that's happening, right? And we think that rule needs to be changed. We need to be the ones, especially as advocates and people with lived experience, to change that rule. So we talk about the policies that's going on in New York City. Sometimes we do the country. We don't sometimes go as broad as that. But right now we're focusing, because we're a very small podcast, on New York City, on what we have here and what we want to be changed. So if we're going to do a certain rally or things like that, we bring people on the show to talk about a certain thing, and we see if people want to come out to this action and things like that. And as many different other things like that. We make sure we have hot topics. It's kind of same things to make sure that people are knowing about what's happening. A lot of times people who are allies would love to help, but they don't know which way to turn. So that's a way to make them informed of what's happening in their community and how they can actually use their voice to do that. And we know people in City Hall sometimes listen to it too, so they can kind of hear and take what they would wish to help change the systems. Because honestly, they're people, nobody's perfect. Nobody has all the answers. But if we all work together as a community and work as one, we could definitely make the city a better place. And New York City is already awesome, if you ask me. I never want to move, but we need to make it better than it is. And I know we can do that if we all work together and not in silos. So that's a little bit what the Hear Our Voices podcast is about. We try to go, hopefully at this point, twice a month of doing things that people want to come on and share their stories and share resources, because we also do that. New York City is rich in resources. The problem is that, honestly, the lines are long for these resources, yes, but also that people don't know where to get them. So we are also, as a FAB, have a resource packet, and we're making sure that people have that, but also talking about the resources. Example, we talked about home base before, Catholic Charities, Canva, and what resources they might have for people. The lines might be long, but you will get the benefits, because I've also gotten the benefits from those home bases. So it's about sharing resources and making sure that people understand what they're eligible for. Because that's another thing too. People don't know that they're eligible for certain things, so they don't know where to go get it. You might have to get a little bit from here, a little bit from there to make your family whole, but you have to do what you got to do to make sure you're happy, healthy, and surviving. So, yeah.
Yeah, so important. And the link is in the chat to the podcast for anybody who's interested in checking it out or subscribing. I know City Limits, we started republishing them, and it's always great to listen to whenever there are new episodes. Cool. So changing gears a little bit, want to talk a little bit about housing. It's been such a major focus of the mayoral election. I think, like all the debates, the first question out the bat was about housing and affordability, and all the candidates agreed, right, that we need more housing. We got to build more of it. But my question for our panelists would be, affordability, how do we make sure that that housing is accessible to folks who really need it, particularly people in the shelter system? Let's start off with Maya. Would you like to kick us off with that sort of accessibility angle?
Sure thing. So I think there's two prongs to this. There's we need to build more affordable housing prong, and it's a sort of supply side question. And then we need to increase access to and then improve the administration of rental assistance programs. And on the city level, it's namely city FEPs, which has already come up a bunch of times in this. And I'll share this October, WIN released a report. It's a full action plan for the next mayor on what they can do to end family homelessness. Now we know it's Mayor-elect Mamdani, and it includes over 40 recommendations on this topic. So if you really want to get into the weeds, I recommend taking a look at our report. But we include recommendations around improving housing access, supportive housing, and rental assistance systems. But to just name a few kind of top line recommendations from it, I think the number one recommendation that we would share is that in 2023, the City Council passed a legislative package expanding the City FEPS program, including removing shelter entry and work requirements and sort of raising the income eligibility for the program. This was vetoed, and then the veto by Mayor Adams, and then it was overridden, and now it's been entangled in a lot of litigation. And I think our number one recommendation is that Mayor-elect Mamdani drop the lawsuit and implement the package, because this expansion package would increase city FEPs to almost 38,000 households, families, we think, in New York City. We also have a suite of recommendations. There are a lot of administrative issues, and I'm sure Jocelyn can really get into this as well with the city FEPs program, a lot of delays that keep families in shelter for longer than necessary. I won't get too into the weeds of that, but again, in our report, if you want to get into like problems with inspections and voucher processing, we have a number of recommendations there. Then to sort of flip to the supply side of the issue, I think we've seen a lot of mayoral administrations, not just the Adams administration, but de Blasio before that, set targets around building new housing. And it's always been sort of pinned around the number of units. We're going to build 200,000 new units of housing. I think this next mayoral administration really needs to focus on affordability in those units. So the rental market in New York City right now has a 1.4 vacancy rate. When you look at families that need affordable housing, it's functionally zero. There is no affordable housing in New York City. So as we think about building new housing, we need to make sure that it is actually pinned and targeted at those who need it. So we recommend in our report that the next mayor build 12,000 units for extremely low income families. So families earning less than 30% of area median income. In 2024, only 2,000 units for that kind of income band were created, which is just not nearly enough. And then the last recommendation I'll say is more of a kind of governance strategy one. Right now in our city government system, we have housing and economic development and the housing authority sit under one deputy mayor, and our social services, human services, homeless services all sit under a different one. We believe at WIN that housing is the solution to homelessness, and DSS is now functionally one of the largest housing authorities because of its administration of city FEPs in the country. And we really believe that we should bring our housing and homeless services agencies together to enable better coordination between them. So we would recommend also creating a deputy mayor for housing and homelessness. Yeah, I'll pause there.
No, that's great. I know we're all kind of anxiously awaiting the appointments in the next administration as the news keeps kind of trickling out about who's getting appointed and who Mayor-elect Mamdani is picking and how he's going to structure that. I think is a big part of that too. Anyone else have anything to add? I'll open up to the group in terms of types of housing we need built, city FEPs problems that need to be streamlined. I know at City Limits we just did a story about a building in Brooklyn that the city. It was originally built as luxury apartments, and then it was sort of like a one-off, I think, that the city opened up to folks in shelter, which we thought was really interesting and unique, probably more of that. But yeah, anyone else want to add anything about that? Whoever would like to go. You can
The affordability problem, I think in general, is a big problem, not only for people in shelter, but also for people who's going to go into shelter. I think a lot of times we think about shelter, I think we got to think about prevention, and the affordability problem will make it. If you make a lot of things much cheaper, I know people want money, but we love living here. People like me love living here, but we need to be able to afford to live in this environment, right? So I think making sure even the numbers were given earlier, making a certain medium income, I think it needs to even be even more than that, because people who make $70,000 a year, you might think this sounds like a lot. When you think about taxes getting taken out and how much food costs and how much they have to get a Metro card, Omni card. So it's like a lot of things have to be factored in to these things. And I think a lot of times people are thinking about how much other factors are around them. If they have kids, it's even more. Baby clothes, baby food. Baby food is very expensive. If you don't have a kid, trust and believe is expensive. So I think really making that cost of living for people in New York City to go down is amazing. City FEPS has a lot of problems. I'm not saying that they have worked on some things, but a lot of kinks need to be working out a little bit more for that, and making sure that clients are informed of what they need to be doing and to get done on their part. But a lot of times, even when clients have stuff done, caseworkers or the system behind that, the HRA plan, is kind of messy. And I think maybe you have to hire more workers, have people do more, hire people for inspections, because that's a lot of holdup for people that I talk to on like at least a couple times a week. That process is very strained, and people will have apartments available when the person actually takes the voucher, because that's another problem right there, and they will miss that apartment because the part on the city is not being done properly. So there's some disconnect there, and if they want to partner with people with experience or just people in shelter in general to make sure that process can work to streamline better and smoother for people on both sides, because I know it could be a hassle on HRA also. I think they need to work on that side as well to make sure that can be a good system, and prevention is better than anything else. So yeah.
Yeah, I know staffing is a big issue. I know the mayor-elect has pledged to staff amply the housing agencies that work on a lot of this. I think both on the side of like housing placements, right, and as well as like source of income discrimination, which you mentioned, which we know is such a widespread problem for folks with vouchers. Great, well, thank you all. To turn to the, when somebody gets a voucher, they do the hard search for an apartment if they're finally able to get one. They move into permanent housing. I would love to ask you all about sort of what happens next, right? Somebody who leaves shelter and is able to secure permanent housing. How do we ensure that they're able to stay there and that they don't return to shelter? I would love to ask, let's start with you, Vanjie. What are some of the barriers that you see families face when they're leaving the shelter system? And are there things in terms of like what's called aftercare services, right, that you think the city should be doing better to make sure people can stay in the housing that they find after shelter?
Okay, so you guys touched briefly on it. I think the biggest barrier that people face when exiting shelter is source of income discrimination. Many people in shelter qualify for or already have vouchers. However, many of them are routinely turned down from apartments due to having a voucher. Then those that successfully do find and rent a place, there's a huge gap in care. A person that's been in shelter and has gone through that trauma now moves into an apartment, and they went from having a case manager, a housing specialist, resources to now being alone in a unit. And they have to basically navigate the bureaucratic process of recertifying and keeping in compliance with the requirements of their subsidy, all while navigating, their own life stressors, work, children, family, et cetera, et cetera. I think this is a place where the city should step in and provide these people with additional services to help them recertify, make the process easier. A lot of the times, I think Jocelyn was speaking about this earlier, people fall into arrears and it's through no fault of their own. It's just like there's a glitch in the system, the payments aren't being sent to the landlord on time, and by the time the person, notices, they're, 1 year in arrears in housing court, et cetera, et cetera. So I think like we should have programs that step in before that point, and they should be widespread, not only, offered through small nonprofits.
Yeah, anyone else want to add to the aftercare point, or sort of recertification is something that comes up in our reporting all the time in terms of problems with that. I think a lot of people, assume it'll be straightforward, and it never is. Jocelyn, you mentioned Jocelyn. Anything to add to that, or anyone who wants to jump in terms of
I think I oversee a couple of portfolio-based aftercare programs. I'll say two things. One is I think that a lot of families that relocate from shelter into community are really poorly prepared to do so with subsidy. A lot of people that we meet with initially, once they've moved in, truly have no idea what their responsibility to pay is. And so you have a lot of families that just sort of start off, not paying the correct amount of, so, when you move into a unit with a subsidy, there's the subsidized portion of the rent, which is paid for by that program. And then there's the portion that the client owes, if any. If the client does have some amount of income that they can pay towards the rent, a huge number of the families that we work with just have no idea what it is that they're supposed to be paying, on top of just getting sort of set up in their new apartment and figuring out, how to pay rent through a particular app that landlord uses, or, figuring out how to separate rent payments from utility and amenity payments and things like that. So it's a much more sort of complicated process for some folks than it should be, really. The other thing about the recertifications is that recertification and rent renewal don't always line up. And so a lot of the times people will submit their recertifications before they have their new lease, which would have a rent increase. So people recertify and then they get their lease renewal, which has a higher rent, for the next year or 2 years, and then they have to go back in and do a modification. And so if all of that isn't done correctly or in tandem, then you can end up with kind of a delta between what the client is paying or what the subsidy is paying and what the rent actually is, which then throws that family into arrears and has to, have a whole host of case management done to fix that. And if that's not fixed in a timely enough manner, then the subsidy can fall totally out of compliance and then needs to be restored, which is a much more complicated process. We make it really hard for people to thrive in this city, for sure.
Gina, did you have anything to add to that? Or no, yeah, whoever would like to go. Sorry, Khadijah, I see you.
You're perfectly fine. I think a lot of times, for example, for people with domestic violence, before they got into shelter, a lot of things, they're getting abused and things right now. And when in the shelter, they're surviving. And when they leave shelter, they're striving, right? And a lot of times people don't understand. Some people, it's a lot of different forms of abuse, but one I'm going to talk about right now is financial abuse. So if that means the abuser was financially taking advantage of this person, right? So when you're in shelter, it's kind of almost your life is not on a full pause, but it's on a slight pause. You're still trying to put it together and making sure things make sense, because before it's like, I'm in this headspace and that's a mental problem already right there. And when you leave shelter, some people end up still in debt and they don't know how to recover that debt, right? And so people have to go to court for these things. And people say, it's under your name, so it should be, no, but I didn't do this. The person did this in my name. So some people are still, even though they're out of shelter, they're still digging into the weeds of getting their life together. And I think we need to make sure we set up a system that really encapsulate that person after they leave shelter. Don't forget about them. And I think that's one way I think we need to have prevention excellent. I didn't go through DV, but I heard people say those things about those particular areas. Me, I came to my apartment. I was supposed to get a furniture allowance, didn't get it. I had to fight with HRA for months to get, and they only gave me half of it. So it's a lot. People think it's amazing coming to your apartment and having your own key and not have to be in the shelter chaos of the world. But when you close the door, you're literally by yourself at this point. There's no caseworkers. There might be a friend or two who understands, but really don't, because they have their own life to go on. And you're trying to make it with this child. And you're trying to really push through life. And it's like, even though you're not in that shelter, you're almost locked back into that place because you're trying to move forward, but still not everything is together. They didn't explain the voucher right. My credit might be messed up. It might not be in a DV situation, but I bought so much food at shelter because I didn't have a stove. So I had to buy food, and my daughter didn't like the frozen food there. That's just my example. Everybody has a different path, and I think they really need to give at least a year or two to help people really get to understand the neighborhood they live in, understand the school system that they're in. Everybody has a different path, and we have to make sure we take that person and see what that person needs and how can you be assistance to that person to make sure they have a successful life and not make it be a recurring thing. That's another thing we have with shelters. It's a generational thing, but also could be that same person going back after that voucher 5 years later or 6 years, depending on how it goes, and they're back into shelter again. We're like, how do you end up here? Well, I didn't get it. I didn't understand. And it's like, if you put that person in a successful position in the first time, they wouldn't have to be back there. Granted, things happen, floods happen, hurricanes, fires, those things can happen. But if we really set this person up in a great way, they won't be end up back in the same situation they were in before.
Yeah, there's a lot of circumstances.
If I can just also add, it's a really poignant. I think there's something to be said also about community, and we assume that people coming out of shelter, just because they're in, permanent, hopefully affordable housing, that they just are appreciative to be there and they are happy to be there. Not taking into account the fact that, folks are dealing with recovering from the trauma that it is entailed going into shelter. On top of the fact that sometimes they're moving into these sort of mixed income apartment buildings or portfolios and feel just sort of stigmatized all over again for being sort of in a living situation with folks that are looking at them like the subsidy folks or the homeless folks or the shelter folks, right? And we work with a lot of people who don't feel comfortable or bought into their new community. And if you don't have people that are bought into where they're living, they're not going to want to sort of actively comply with their lease requirements or pay their rent on time or even live there. So there's something I think to be said about the landlord communities as well that are sort of welcoming people from shelter into their into their buildings, and what kinds of services they're willing to invest in to make sure that those families have supports that are not stigmatizing, right? Not sort of like the standalone set aside offices for the subsidy folks that live in that building, but services that are available to people to help them to to sort of get used to where they are, right? I mean, and there's also moving from one borough to another is a lot easier said than done. So you have a lot of folks too that are not at all familiar with where their new home is and have to acclimate to that, and that can be really difficult.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to take into account. Gina, yeah, please add to that.
Sure. And just before I talk more and build off of Jocelyn's point, I do want to just say that, the new mayoral administration really has an opportunity to change the perception that landlords have of city FEPs if they really invest in the systems improvements, some of which Maya referenced earlier. I've mentioned EHV already, and I will again as I talk about our aftercare. But there are a lot of best practices that HRA can really adopt from Section 8, and there is a very big difference in perception of ability for HRA to administer subsidies versus NYCHA and HPD, who have been much more successful in managing their portfolios, maintaining consistent payments to landlords, and really just having a more streamlined process. So that is, something that I see as a top priority to allow shelter stays to be shorter and not happen wherever possible, and also reduce the burden that comes back to home-based providers later on when restorations are needed because of recertification issues, sudden payment turnoffs, things like that. But when we think about aftercare, we see this as most successful when we see that there are clear handoffs that are made at the time of placement and families have a direct point of contact. So when New Destiny was awarded the HB Housing Navigation contract to provide that housing search support to survivors and community, we knew from our permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing programs how important aftercare is, and that was not present within the contracts and the funding available. So what New Destiny did is we raised money to be able to operate an aftercare program a little bit more minimal than what we typically offer, but to ensure that there was a level of aftercare that survivors could access to really facilitate that transition. So this included a light touch model that supported with recertifications as well as referrals to mental health. And over 3/4 of survivors who were placed through our program decided to opt into that voluntary aftercare program. It was not a requirement, but overwhelmingly, the survivors wanted to access that additional support after placement because, number one, it was voluntary and it was a resource that they can access as needed. It wasn't going to be compulsory or mandated in any way. We were able to also work with an evaluator on this to really assess the effectiveness of the program. And we were able to actually release a report recently that showed some of the preliminary findings of the aftercare program and some of the areas of effectiveness. We found significant improvements across housing stability measures for the survivors who participated in our aftercare program, over 500 survivors, which were covered across housing stability, ability to meet basic needs, safety-related empowerment, parental stress, and incidence of IPV. So all of those measures saw a statistically significant improvement, which is something really incredible to show that aftercare does work when it's done effectively. And part of that was warm referrals, connections before they're settled into the apartment, so there's not that interruption. You know, we see that the critical moment of move-in is so important to keep that engagement going, because if we do not do that beforehand, you know, people are finally settled into their apartment, they want some breathing room, and they might not know who to contact afterwards once they might be experiencing some challenges. And the program operated through the household's first recertification to make sure that they received any support needed as they recertified their voucher for the very first time. But yeah, I'm really excited to kind of dive more into that evaluation as people read more about it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And the link for that is in the chat too, if anyone wants to check more about that aftercare program and its effectiveness. Thank you for sharing. I know we're getting to our last few minutes. If anyone has any questions, I think there are a couple of questions in the Q&A chat, but you can toss them in there. If we have time, we'll try to get to them. One person asked, thank you, Amy, for your question. If a family is unhappy or unsafe with their shelter and would like help moving, is there an organization or something that they can turn to for help? I think that's something we hear at City Limits from readers a lot who are in the shelter system and are very unhappy with their placement. Does anyone have any kind of advice for somebody who is in that situation? Or is there any recourse for folks who are looking to be moved or are unhappy with where they are in shelter?
I'm going to tell you the truth. They say go back to path and say this is happening, but honestly, a lot of times it doesn't work. The system in that way, I think it's broken in that area. But they at one point had a phone number. I'm not sure if it's still working. I haven't used it in a while. I've been at the shelter 7 years. They had a number you can call for these problems. Call 311. 311 in shelter is your friend. I called them about roaches, about a leak, about many things, and they got on their stuff right away. So 311 could be a friend. Granted, again, I haven't been out in the system for 7 years, so it might be changing, but 311, if you get caught on a lot of things in New York City, they kind of push the people who need to be pushed properly. So yeah, that's a little bit of advice if you are in a shelter and that's happening. I'm not saying PATH doesn't work completely, but 9 out of 10 people tell me going there does not help.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
I think you run the risk when you're doing a shelter transfer of being transferred to an even more unsafe or unsatisfactory shelter. So when I worked, you know, on the other side of things and helping folks to access shelter, you know, that was always something that we prepped people about, is that, you know, if you try to transfer, you may end up in a situation that might be worse for your family. So just to be prepared for that.
Yeah, wow.
And I'll just add there are so many people who choose to leave shelter because they're unsatisfied with services, and being able to offer a bit more streamlining of continued eligibility for the vouchers without having to reapply at home base is really critical, particularly when working with special populations such as domestic violence survivors, youth, and others where they continue to be vulnerable and at risk once they leave shelter in the community if they have not exited to permanent housing.
That's helpful. Thank you. So kind of my final question for you all, and then if we have a couple extra minutes, maybe I'll grab another one from the Q&A. But you know, we're going to have a new mayor come January 1st. We now know who that is. It's going to be Zohran Mamdani. I know that everyone has sort of a wish list and priorities, right, that we want the next mayor to tackle. Are there things that the current administration has done that you would consider like success stories, or things that that the next administration could keep going? If, you know, I think we talked a lot about problems, but are there any sort of like, yeah, successes or good points that have the city has undergone in the last few years that you would recommend the next administration keep or build on? Whoever would like to answer that, I'll open up to anybody.
I'll start. So it was a group that started, we call it IA, which is Impacted Advocates. It started in this administration. Have we been used to our best of our abilities? No, but it had the point that it was a start. And I will hope that this next administration will, you know, make it be bigger and better and really make us have a say-so in that. That group is Impacted Advocates. We're all people who are formerly homeless at one point in our lives. Whether it's 20 years ago, last year, it doesn't matter. We go from DV, families, whether it's with adults or with children, veterans. We are a cast of people who have experienced this homelessness in New York, and we want to be better utilized to make sure that the city is using our voices and making sure that we can hear the people. That's another way of doing narrative change. People think that, you know, these things about homelessness, but we do have a voice and we do have ideas to make the system better. Again, all ideas are not always good ideas, but we do have ideas to help make the city work. And I hope that he keeps that group to make sure that we can strive and make the city better. And I hope he can work with us to make sure we can do our thing and make more housing and have less shelters. So, yeah.
Yeah, you know, that's something a couple people have mentioned to me as something they want to keep, is this idea of that impacted advisory group, and like keeping folks with lived experience, you know, on the horn and giving advice and having a direct influence on policy. So thank you for sharing that. Anyone else have any like success stories that you think that the city should keep or build on, or you know, kind of good things that have come out of the last few years?
I think we've seen in the last, especially like 2 years or so, the cities start to, again, in pilots, but like take on the crisis of infant homelessness in particular. And that's kind of come through something called the Project Crib pilot, which is happening at PATH. There's also a pilot called Fast Track happening at PATH that are particularly tackling resources for pregnant parents entering PATH and entering the shelter system. And then in the city council, there has been a guaranteed income pilot targeted again at pregnant parents experiencing housing insecurity. And again, they're small scale, but I think even just the acknowledgement that there is an infant homelessness crisis, that pregnancy itself can be a driver of homelessness, that lack of access to childcare and the high cost of childcare itself is both preventing people from exiting shelter and driving people into the shelter system is really key. And I think there is an opportunity. I mean, it's like about 2,000 babies are born in shelter each year. And I think there is an opportunity, should Mayor Mamdani want to take this up, to like really tackling infant homelessness, making that kind of a legacy initiative of his mayoral administration. And yeah, I can give more details about Project Crib and such, but I would just throw that out there.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. That's a good one.
Yeah, and I know that New Destiny is also part of the steering committee of Home from the Start, which is similarly working to end homelessness among babies. And other than that, really going back to adopting best practices within Section 8 among HRA administered subsidies. In 2022, city FAPs and FEPs were finally brought up to the Section 8 voucher payment standards after being well below market rents for many, many years. And that allowed those vouchers to be more easily utilized, but only if we can continue to make those additional systems improvements so that FEPs and city FEPs are effective, payments can remain stable, and the package processing can be reduced in terms of timeline.
Great. Well, thank you so much to our panelists. There is a question in the chat about students in temporary housing, which is a good segue. So for the person who put that question in the chat, hang on, because we're going to talk about that coming up. So I'd love to turn it over to Jennifer Pringle, who is the Director of Project Lit at Advocates for Children, who's going to talk more specifically about students in temporary housing. Thank you. And thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. And thanks all for those of you who are able to stay on. I am going to share my screen now. And I am here to talk about students in temporary housing. In particular, a report that Advocates for Children came out with earlier this fall that showed that over 154,000 students were identified as homeless last year. That represents 1 in every 7 students. And you'll see on this slide in what school districts, the percentage of the rate of homelessness by school district. The darker districts represent a higher concentration of student homelessness. And, you know, as panelists, as the other panelists have mentioned, family homelessness is unfortunately not a new issue in New York City. This is the 10th year in a row that there were over 100,000 students identified as homeless. And I'm going to go through a few slides that have a little bit more data about from our report. So here you can see student homelessness over time. This past school year, there were nearly 65,000 students in shelter. This is a cumulative count, so for the entire school year, the number of students who were in shelter. There were also 82,000 students in temporary doubled up situations, doubled, tripled up, shared housing situations, where families were temporarily sharing the housing of others because they were evicted or otherwise lost their housing, and were not, was not a permanent arrangement. They were not leaseholders. They were temporarily sharing the housing of others. And then there was about 7,000 students who were living in other types of temporary housing arrangements, like abandoned buildings on the streets, hotels, motels, and other inadequate housing arrangements. On this next slide, you can see the breakdown of student homelessness by borough. So, you know, you can see here that the Bronx had the highest concentration of student homelessness out of all of the 5 boroughs, at 17.4%, followed by Manhattan. So in both the Bronx and Manhattan, 1 out of every 6 students were identified as homeless last school year. In Brooklyn and Queens, it was 1 out of every 8 students. You know, Manhattan, as you can see here, the teal line had the highest concentration of students in shelter at 9% of enrolled students were students living in shelter. That's about 1 in every 11 students. On this next slide, this is based on data from the 2023-24 school year, looking at the rate at which students are identified in temporary housing as having a disability. So students who have individualized education programs or IEPs. As you can see, for students in shelter, prior to the pandemic, about 1/3 of students in shelter were identified as having an IEP. That fell during the pandemic, and for the 2023-24 school year was still about 18%. That, you know, below the rate for permanently housed students. So, you know, this is a time for the past couple of years, students in temporary housing, particularly those in shelter, have been less likely to have be connected with special education services. I don't think that is because the incidence of disabilities has actually gone down. I think this is pointing to an identification issue. Next slide is about chronic absenteeism. For students who are homeless, especially those in shelter, they had extraordinarily high rates of chronic absenteeism. That means missing 10% or more of the school year. That's about 18 days for the whole school year, about a month of school. For students in shelter, the rate of chronic absenteeism was 67% compared to 32% for their permanently housed peers. So more than double the rate. On this next slide, this is looking at school transfers. This is the percentage of students who transferred schools mid-year. As you can see, students in shelter have the transfer at a rate much higher than their permanently housed peers. 1 in 8 students in temporary housing transferred schools, but for students in shelter, that was 1 in 6 students transferred schools mid-year, compared to about 1 in 24 permanently housed students. Why is this important, school transfers? Well, students who frequently transfer schools fall behind academically. And also we know that school communities can provide a tremendous amount of support, not only for students, but also their parents as well, and helping them along into achieving permanency outside of the shelter system. On this next slide, we have the reading and math proficiency rates. Again, this is for 2024. Students, there are massive disparities for students in temporary housing, and particularly those in shelter. Only 22% of students in shelter in grades 3 through 8 were proficient in the English language arts or reading state exam and math exam. So, you know, we have a lot to do to make sure that students in temporary housing get the supports that they need to be successful in school. And then finally, we have the graduation rates. In 2024, only 62% of students in shelter graduated high school within 4 years. And that's compared to 85% of their permanently housed peers. So again, a significant disparity between the two rates. And 1 in 8 students in shelter dropped out of high school. That's more than 3 times the rate for their permanently housed peers. This is tremendously important, because what we know is education is key to breaking the cycle of homelessness. I know we've spent this past hour talking about the need for affordable housing and the obstacles around some of the subsidies we have, but we also have to focus on education as well if we want our young people today who are in temporary housing never to return to shelter. Young people who do not get a high school diploma are 4.5 times more likely to experience homelessness as young adults. So it is critical that we focus supports on students experiencing homelessness and make sure that they get the services and supports that they need to be successful. On this last slide here, we have some recommendations. We are recommending that the new administration launch a bold interagency initiative to tackle some of these educational barriers. One of which is increasing shelter placements closer to where children attend school to avoid those long commutes and unnecessary school transfers. As folks have talked about, families have to go to PATH in the Bronx to apply for shelter, and 40% of those families are placed in shelter in a different borough from where their kids go to school, which means tremendously long commutes for families who want to keep their students connected to their same schools. And we hear oftentimes of parents making a choice between, do I try to make sure that my child stays connected with their same school community, their teachers, their friends, or keep my job or go to the housing appointment. Parents should not be put in that position where they have to choose between those. We also recommend that in order for the city to better focus on students in temporary housing, there needs to be greater leadership in the form of a deputy chancellor focused on students in temporary housing. And then guarantee timely transportation. We hear all the time from parents who are waiting weeks. I have parents, it's November 13th. I am working with parents to this day who still don't have a school bus for their child. And busing is critical for school stability and regular attendance. And similarly connected to that is making sure that we have school bus contracts that meet the needs of students, families, and schools. I raced through that because I wanted to share some time for questions, not only about what I just presented, but if there are other questions that you want to ask of other panelists as well. I'm looking at the chat there about the coordination. All shelters have students and temporary housing Department of Ed staff assigned to them to help support families in those shelters. But there are over 300 shelters in the city, and there are far fewer Department of Ed workers. So oftentimes you have shelters who don't have full-time contacts there to support families. So it's, an area that definitely needs more attention. And again, I just want to go back to some of those educational indicators I mentioned. Education is the key to making sure young people today graduate, if they get the support they need now, they can graduate from high school and never return to shelter. But for too many families, when they enter shelter, it derails their child's education. It disrupts their child's education. They are not getting the services that they need. They have to transfer schools, and again, there are delays in terms of getting the child situated, making sure the services are in place. Long delays with transportation. We have to address some of these systemic issues that are setting kids behind. We know where the families are. We know where the students are. So we should make sure that we are better targeting those supports. Again, making shelter placements closer to kids' schools. I just was recently contacted by a family her child has her medical services, mental health services, all in the Bronx, was placed in a shelter way out by the airport in Queens. She's like, I have no way to get him back to school, get back to his healthcare providers. No family should be put in that position where shelter means a complete disruption of their support network and their educational services. So again, we need to, with the new administration, to really be targeted on our supports for students in shelter to make sure there's a more robust support system to better keep kids connected with their existing supports and build on those so that they can be healthy and successful and thrive in school. I give us 1 minute.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I see so much nodding around our panelists because everything you're saying is on point with what everyone's been saying today. I just want to thank everyone so much for being part of this panel. Thank you, Jennifer, for providing that important data, and for Advocates for Children, all you do. Thank you, Jean Marie, for hosting this and running this panel. And thank you for all our panelists, Gina, Jocelyn, Vanjie, Khadija, Maya. It's been such a rich and important conversation. And obviously there's a lot more work to do, but we have a real opportunity with the new administration. And I know that everyone who's been part of this work will continue to do it. And I really encourage those who are listening to stay engaged with all the organizations and individuals who've been part of today's discussion. And I also encourage you to stay tuned we have a third and final webinar in the series, which is focused on unlocking potential, a vision for New York City's youth. And that will take place on December 11th. So again, thank you, everyone. And hope that everyone has a great rest of your afternoon, and we will stay in touch. Thank you.